This is a lecture in History 1302 on the Great Depression and the New Deal in American life and politics during the 1930s. The Great Depression is one of the great cataclysmic events in the history of the United States. It caused thousands and thousands of people, frankly several million, to lose their jobs, lose their livelihoods, lose their homes, and in some cases lose their lives because they couldn't afford medical care or some other sort of reason. For those who survived the Great Depression, it was probably one or two major events of their life, outside of the obvious ones like a marriage or the death of a father or mother, what have you. It would be up there, I would say, for those who survived went through the Great Depression. It would be up there along with, if you were older at the time, maybe getting swept up into the First World War. Certainly, if you were younger, like my grandfather was, who was born in 26, or others who were born in that same general era, you would have been saying it would be equivalent to living through World War II. So that generation, or the generations plural, that lived through the Great Depression, they were a tried generation, and they were a tough generation that came up through it. The area and the way the United States looked in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt took on the office of the President of the United States after easily and in fact routing Herbert Hoover and the Republicans in the 1932 elections. Franklin Roosevelt's got a real mess on his hands. Hoover was a spent force. Everybody could see it. There was no real doubt that Roosevelt would win. It's just a matter of how much he would win by, and then more particularly, what would he do once he won. So in 1933, Roosevelt becomes president. He is inaugurated with those famous words, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," and then he gets underway. Today, when a president is inaugurated, whether it's Republican or Democrat, there's often a reference to what is the president going to do in the first 100 days. That has not always been the case in American history. In fact, as I might have referenced with the telling of James Garfield's assassination in 1881, most of the time in the early days of the Republic, even for the first 150 years of the Republic, the president didn't come in with a grandiose scheme about how he's going to wipe away every tear and heal up the nation and bind the wounds or what have you. Some would be more so, maybe some might come close to that. Say Lincoln, of course, in the crisis of the Civil War, would be an example that there were things that had to be done. But the vast majority of the presidents who come into office in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, and even before, are going to be filling offices, filling jobs, hiring people like Garfield was doing. There was no such thing as the 100 days. But because of the crisis of the Great Depression and how bad that was, and how wide and deep the hurt was, again, remembering you've got 20 or 25% unemployment, foreclosures, banks have collapsed, money is scarce in the sense that you have high interest rates, also the trade is dried up, you have just a calamity on your hands, and the question is, what do we do now? And so for Roosevelt, his answer is known generally at the outset as the 100 days of the New Deal. It is a form of relief. It is that's the initial aspect of the New Deal, was we have got to get some relief and stability into the system. And so the Congress, at the behest of the Roosevelt administration, the Congress in 1933 is going to be made up of a lot of individuals who had supported Roosevelt, supported a New Deal, and some might have been even more radical than Roosevelt. All that to say is that you're going to have a series and packages of legislation passing through the United States Congress that are kind of like an alphabet soup of programs. We won't go through every one of them, but at the same time, we'll go through the major ones in the relief and then recovery sections of the New Deal. They are transformative in some ways about the role of the government in life of the economy, and what it can do and what it can't do. What is the proper role of the U.S. government with regard to economic relief? You'll never have seen, even with Hoover, who did more than most, you will never see, prior to 1933 and the New Deal years, you won't see the U.S. government act in such a manner to stabilize the banking system or anything of this sort. Prior to the New Deal, many times the U.S. government sat on the sidelines or did very little. That was just part of the understanding and the part of the practice of the government at that time period. So this is a real sea change. It probably had to be done, though, because of the depth and the persistence of this event. Well, anyways, one of the first things that Roosevelt has to figure out, and the Congress has to figure out, is how do you settle down the banking system. It will do no good to spend a whole lot of money on this or that, or feeding the people or what have you, in a nation that is made up of capitalists, and capitalism, if the banking system and the monetary system is unstable, untrustworthy, and frankly something you would not take a chance on. Ultimately, when we talk about that, so one of the first things Roosevelt has to do is that they have got to get people to trust the banks again. So you're going to see a raft of legislations passed in the first days, literally days, of the New Deal, of the Roosevelt administration, designed to strengthen and to stabilize the banking system. The easiest one to point to, and just simplicity's sake for us as we lecture through this, is the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, and by the way, get used to me using a lot of acronyms, because there are a lot of acronyms in these early days, and even throughout the New Deal. But the FDIC is designed to give investors, and more particularly depositors, such as my grandmother, or great-grandmother, who lost her life savings in a collapsed bank in San Antonio through really no fault of her own. The fact of the matter is that really she and others like her needed to be convinced that putting their money back in a bank was a safe thing. So in the early days of this New Deal, the FDIC is designed to be insurance. Literally, the name gives it away. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The idea is that if you put a certain amount of money in a bank, the federal government will back that, and you won't lose your life savings. You need to get the money out of the mattresses. You need to get it out of the coffee cans in the backyard. You need to get the money back into the bank. You need to, in essence, you need the people to capitalize the banking system, meaning put money into the bank. So the banks can in turn, obviously, loan money out. You can start to circulate money through the system. This is not going to be a quick return to the roaring 20s. Certainly that's not in the offing here. In fact, actually, when we talk about this, it's fair to remember the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. Never during the Great Depression does the unemployment rate in the United States drop below about 10% until World War II breaks out in Europe, and all those orders from France and Britain and elsewhere start flowing in, and American factories and American produce or production goes back into hyperdrive. That's what ends the Great Depression. However, there is a role to play, and the U.S. government is going to do that in the form of the FDIC. So that would be one. That's on the banking side. And there's others out there. I mean, you've got Glass-Steagall, which is designed to kind of separate investment banking from Main Street banking and loans and so forth. There's a whole bevy of practices and so forth. You're going to see even more regulation in the banking system. But as a alphabet soup, I use the FDIC as the example. Another thing that we talked about in the previous lecture about the cause of the Great Depression was the collapse in the farm prices and the collapse of farming. And so one of the things that was designed, and this is going to be another one of those acronyms, the AAA, the AAA, which stands for the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The Agricultural Adjustment Act is going to do something that was probably wrong-headed in my opinion, but at the same time the design was we have got to get the supply down. We have got to get the glut of food down. We've got to get the glut that is on the market down. If you've got many people who are starving, and you did actually in the United States in the early 1930s, it would be wise that you probably should be figuring out a way to distribute food to the hungry, beyond just shooting the animals at the Cincinnati Zoo, for an example. But anyways, that's not what will happen. Today we subsidize and support farmers and farming and agribusiness. You see a lot of that because of the representatives from the states of Iowa, Minnesota, and beyond. But in that time period, they didn't subsidize the farmers and just say, you plant and you produce. They paid, meaning the AAA was going to pay, the Agricultural Department is going to pay farmers to plow under crops. And that's why I said it was probably in the scheme of humanity and humanitarianism, if you like, an unwise decision, because you do have many people who are, if not starving, they are hungry, and you can feed with those plowed under crops. But the idea was ultimately, whether it's plowing under a crop, shooting hogs, etc., and so on, you're trying to drive down the prices, or rather drive down the supply, and thereby raise up the prices, and it does have an effect in that sense. It's not a panacea. It's not a foolproof practice, but it is there. Also something that you'll see, too, during this time period, and I agree, this is where I would also criticize the New Deal in hindsight, is that they also made it very clear that, especially if you had a real activist local the administrator, it was not permissible for you to grow your own garden. Right now, as I've recording this lecture in the spring of 2020, I have taken the time to plow and plant a garden. And so what are we going to do with the garden? We planted 1,000 cucumbers, seemingly, and 1,000 sets of green beans, and 1,000 this and whatever. I mean, it's a good-sized garden, to say the least. We'll probably have more, if it grows, we'll have more than we know. But in the Great Depression, the AAA is going to have a facet to it where they basically say you cannot grow your own garden because it affects the prices. You want to make people to go out and buy. In fact, there was a famous court case where a man who had, and I probably ought to look this up and have the note in front of me, but it was during the Great Depression. A man had planted a garden. He was not selling his product. He was using it for personal consumption. And the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and in the late 1930s, the Supreme Court says, oh, by the way, that is illegal regulation of commerce by the Congress. Anyways, those sorts of things are out there, but in the main, however, the AAA is pointed toward, as the name would imply, reining in agricultural destruction, or at least buffeting and pushing up the prices. The next thing up would be is that you would also need to see some industrial regulations come in, and you're going to have the NRA and the NIRA, which are industrial regulatory acts designed to, in some respects, produce I would call it a planned economy, something akin to what you'd see in other nations at the time period. The thing to remember about Roosevelt and his boys are that many of them were junior men, meaning junior officers, junior bureaucrats in the old Wilson administration or the old Roosevelt administration of the progressive era. So they cut their teeth ultimately, and they learned at the knee of the progressives of the early 1900s, and here they are in the 1930s given the reins because of the great calamity. And one of the things that progressivism always has a habit of doing is there's a real bent toward regulation. They probably, whether it was right or wrong depends on the exact circumstance, but you're going to see heavy attempts and at times heavy regulation of the industrial order, the industrial society. As in essence, maybe there was too much competition. In that same vein, too, you'll also see one of the great golden eras of labor breakout. So it wasn't just regulation of industry, but it's also the recognition and the legal protection of the right to unionize and to collectively bargain. That is under what's known as the Wagner Act, and more particularly it produces what's called the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB. That is the U.S. government coming down more particularly at this time period and even up through the 40s and 50s, 1940s and 1950s. You'll see labor get into the game and be able to win through negotiation, strike in some cases, certainly government support in others. They're going to win higher wages, retirement, and so forth. In a sense, this is one of the ways that the great booming and blooming of the middle class occurs in the United States. Was there a middle class prior to the 1930s or prior to the laborizing of, the widespread introduction of labor unions in America? Yeah. But this is where you can have an idea of, say, in the 1950s, a man who is a member of a labor union, say the United Auto Workers or the AFL and CIO or some other group, is going to be able to collectively bargain with his employer. He's able to work a 40-hour week, maybe a 35-hour week, because it's mostly going to be men in this industrial laboring. They're going to be able to work a reasonable week, week, 5 days a week. Maybe it's Sunday through Thursday or something like that, but 5 days a week. They'll have retirement pensions. In addition to that, they'll also be able to be the sole breadwinner of the family. And so if you ever wondered where the nuclear family, as we kind of understood it over the last half century in the United States came from, I would argue it came from here, at least amongst industrial parts of the United States in Ohio and Michigan, Wisconsin. I think of the Rust Belt particularly, as we call it, Pennsylvania. That stuff right there where you could have a man work in a factory or work in a mill or work somewhere that's in labor, has a labor union, and they're able to feed and support their family and have kids and so forth. That starts here in the Great Depression with the NLRB. So that's a major development as well. But getting beyond the economy, these are, I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to go through them all, but there's a bunch of them out there. But also a bunch of labor programs and a bunch of New Deal programs. Also out there, too, is some other things that I think were really, really good for the country. Sometimes you'll hear people poo-poo this on the right, but the more I've thought about it, I guess maybe it's the change in my ways and the change in my thinking. But the more I've thought about it, I think this was good policy by the U.S. government under Franklin Roosevelt. The example I use here is Rural Electrification Administration, the REA. But you'll see others that are kind of cousins to it and sisters and brothers in a sense, if you like, personifying a government program. The example would be the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and where they produce electrified dams. But the Rural Electrification Administration is going to commence the great electrifying of the United States. And when I talked about this, this is something where I'm bringing I'm squaring the circle, as it were, and bringing stuff to a close. But if you remember from an earlier lecture during the semester, especially say when I was talking about Waco and what it was like to live on the farm and what was the most important thing in the life of a woman, which was the electrification, this is what I'm talking about now. So as I said, for the man, it's going to be the internal combustion engine, which really took hold in the 20s and 30s before the Depression hit, and that slowed down production, obviously. But for the woman, it's in the 30s and 40s where electrification comes to rural America. It's fair to remember that during the 1890s and early 1900s, electrification had come to New York. It had come to Philadelphia, come to Detroit, come to Chicago, even cities that we wouldn't consider big cities or even prominent cities, like Caldwell, Texas, which is right down the road from me. It's a county seat for Burleson County, where I live. Small towns, frankly, they had electricity in their town in the early 1900s, maybe 1905, 1910. But they were electrified. But yet, even into the 1920s and 1930s before the REA, you did not have electrification of those communities. You did not have electrification of the small town, the small town. And you certainly didn't have it out in the countryside like where I live, where I'm not informally a town. But yet, electricity is here. The rural electrification, I think, could have only been done by the federal government that was willing to spend a lot of money and, obviously it employs individuals to do it. They hire them directly or they pay through the contractor aspect, but they put up electricity throughout rural America. And it takes 20 years to get it all done. So some parts of the country still weren't electrified until about 1950. But it wasn't going to be electrified by the private sector is ultimately my point. This was one of the great things that I would say Roosevelt and his administration did that's out there. So rural electrification was one of the great booms to society, I would argue. It really took the countryside out of the primitive era out of the year one and shoved it into the 20th century overnight, in a sense. So when we talk about rural electrification, another one of the alphabet soups of the New Deal administration was the CCC, which stands for the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, the Civilian Conservation Corps is directed toward young men. Excuse me. when we talk about directed toward young men, we're talking about young men who are 18 and 19 and 20 and 25 years old, many of whom are single, and many of whom have no prospects of work. Some of them had been laid off. Some of them never got a job. And the worst thing that you can have happen for a society is have a bunch of young men with no prospects of work, maybe really no prospect of marriage, which can be a great domesticating aspect on the man. And I mean that in a sex-specific sort of way. It's not always true, of course, but it does have a hand in it. But at the same time, too, is in the Great Depression, if you can't get a job, what do? Now, these young men aren't going to starve to death, probably. They may have hungry nights. But young men with nothing to do and boring afternoons, they might spend their money on booze, or they might turn to a life of crime, or, some things dramatic, some things less so, but all destructive to society. So one of the facets, and it goes beyond the CCC, but one of the facets of the New Deal was not a welfare payment of just, I'll give you money to do nothing. The fact is that we will give you money to do something. And in the term you can maybe use in your notes is workfare, not welfare, but workfare. And the CCC would be an example of that. These young men will be hired hired directly by the federal government. They will wear uniforms that are very similar to, say, military-style uniforms. You might see them that they look a lot like they'd been in the Army, and there is a militaristic aspect to it. But the idea was to give these young men work, give them money, and let them build stuff for the country. Build stuff would include, but not be limited to, say, the Red Rock Amphitheater outside of Denver, one of the great amphitheaters in America, maybe the world even. That was essentially a CCC project. Maybe roadside parks, maybe low bridges, maybe this, maybe that. But the idea of giving young men work, giving them money, and then part of the stipulation was they had to take that money and basically give 90% of it or so to the family. And so that they could help subsidize and protect the old mom and pop who may not be able to work because they lost the farm, they live in a house, the industry shut down, or you see where I'm going with this. So that workfare aspect is pervasive throughout the New Deal, especially on the job side, jobs, and jobs. Again, you're not giving people money, they're working for it, which is not a bad thing. I would say it's a good thing to make sure people work within reason and so forth. But all that to say is that the CCC was designed to keep young men out of trouble, and in the most dark and foreboding aspect of its thinking is that you keep them out of trouble and you keep them from becoming radicals. Because in the 1930s, you look around the world, and it's fair to remember is that the United States is not in isolation, even though we sometimes may try to be. And that's a good word to put in your notes too, is that in the 1930s, the vast majority of Americans were isolationists. They basically had said, we need to stay out of foreign affairs. But sometimes war is interested in you. Sometimes foreign affairs is interested in you. I believe it was Leon Trotsky, the Soviet Bolshevik revolutionary, who said this famously, that you may have no interest in war, but war has an interest in you. I think that's a true statement, actually. But in the 1930s, you look around and you say, what's going on in other parts of the world? Obviously, in the 1930s, you see the rise of Hitlerism and the Nazi or National Socialist Party in Germany. In addition to that, you're also going to see in the 1930s the rise of not just socialism, but it actually began in 1917, and you can find precursors to 17. But you also see the flowering and the blooming of the Soviet Union, which appeared to many outsiders who visited the Soviet Union as this most glorious experiment in the new man, the new society, the new commune, as it was, hence the word, kind of the idea of the word communist. And some American admirers and visitors will be taken to Russia, Soviet Union, same difference in a sense. Taken to the Soviet Union, taken to the various cities, and they will see it, and they're like, I believe it was Lincoln Steffens who said, I have seen the future, and it works. They don't talk of it. They didn't get to see the Gulag Archipelago or any of that stuff that goes with the communist, because we're talking about Joseph Stalin here, who is no peach. But those are two worrisome facets on the one hand. Nazi National Socialism in Germany with Hitler, or communism that you see in the Soviet Union. And in the United States, quite honestly, the more the more attractive to radical elements in the United States was not Nazism. In all honesty, the more attractive element you find is the issue of the Soviet Union, is the issue of communism. There were many people in the 1930s who were fervently hoping and maybe even praying for, but many of them were not believers of any God, but they were certainly hoping for and agitating for and pushing for a communist revolution in the United States or in England or in France. You will have many members of the Communist Party found in all those countries throughout the 1930s. It is not fair to say, and it is not true to say, that the communist threat was an overblown threat during the 1930s. It was there, and it was big. So, for example, you found them in academia all over the Ivy Leagues. You found them and other universities in the United States or in Europe. You also found them in circles in science, in high society, polite society, writers, liberal arts society, so to speak, writers, journalists, and so on. And in Hollywood, you had some very prominent leftist, hard left, communist, Bolshevik types in Hollywood. So the CCC, going back to the original point, the CCC was designed, amongst other things, to tamp down on the growth, as it were, the spreading of communism amongst the kids or amongst the young. Because it's also fair to remember, I hadn't said this yet, but I think I'll say it in the lecture on communism, Nazism. Both of those groups, plus others like them, they all had their fighter units, their red fighters, or their SA boys with their brown shirts. Whatever they were, they had these street fighters who were made up of young men who liked to drink, liked to get caroused, and liked to break off table legs and get into fights. If you think people won't do that, if you get a blank check to do all three of those things, there's a lot of young men who say, yeah, I'll take that up. And that was the fear in the United States, and that's part of the reason why you're going to have a CCC, which is designed to keep the young out of trouble and give them something to do. So we have all those programs out there, and they have a part to play and a role to play, and they do help some. So there is some relief being doled out. The unemployment rate in the United States does slowly come down over time. By the mid-1930s, it's in the 14 to 15% territory, so it is down. You don't have the dramatic fistfights over garbage like you did before. There is better hope there. Again, it's not to say that everything is champagne and oysters and sunshine is just around the corner. But things are more stable in 1935 than they were in 1932 when Roosevelt is elected. But that's the Great Depression was still on. So the second part of our discussion is going to be not just relief, but recovery. So what do you do? Well, one of the things that Roosevelt in the mid-1930s is dealing with is those radical elements that are coming up on his flanks. Sometimes you'll have, frankly, anti-Semitic and certainly hard-edged preaching from, say, a Roman Catholic priest named Father Charles Coughlin, who is basically a rabble-rouser. Then you have another coming up on the left flank of Roosevelt, which is Charles Townshend, Dr. Charles Townshend, who is an elderly physician who is promoting essentially the forced retirement of the old, say 60 years old at the time, because people didn't live it that long. They would be forced into retirement. You would give them a monthly pension of, say, $2,000 or whatever the number would be, and then they would be compelled under penalty of law to spend that money each month. It's kind of a scheme. It really doesn't work, but at the same time, to people who are still desperate and still hurting, it sounds pretty good. Get the old out of the way so the young can take over and work. And then probably the most dangerous of all politically to Franklin Roosevelt in 1935 was a senator from Louisiana named Huey Long, Huey Pierce Long of Louisiana. And I'll say this as a historian, as a kid who has liked to read history for a long time. One of the ways I've learned history is by reading biography. I find that to be, especially in the hands of a man who knows or a woman who knows how to write, I really find that to be an attractive way to learn how to learn history. I love it. I like that. Maybe it's because the first real deep biography, adult-sized biography I read was this thick, and it was called simply Huey Long by a man named T. Harry Williams. Dr. Williams was a professor at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, old LSU. And he wrote Huey Long in the late 1950s. And Long, that book was a collection of interviews by people who knew Huey Long. Long had been dead by that point in time, 20, 25 years, and so a lot of folks found it permissible to speak. Others were given permission to speak, and they would speak only on in anonymity. The word confidential communications comes in again and again, but it makes for a fascinating study in Huey Long and in Louisiana politics. Well, I can get into the weeds on it. I enjoyed that, as you can tell. I've read that book through twice, once in high school and once about 5 or 6, 7 years ago. Anyways, why I bring up Huey Long is that it was Huey Long in the 1930s that seemed to be a radical who was going to be perhaps the real main left-leaning challenger to old Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. It was Long who said that we need to do more. And if you look at what Huey had done in Louisiana, he is going to make some real changes in Louisiana. Louisiana was a desperately poor state with a couple of little small pockets of very wealthy men and families in the state. At the time of, say, Huey Long's ascension in the 1920s, remember, say, mid-1920s in Long's case, 1927, 28, Louisiana, prior to Huey Long, had like 100 miles of paved roads, 100 miles of, asphalt roads, and a few 100 miles of concrete roads, and several hundred miles of gravel roads. But for a state that's going to be, it's not the biggest state in the world. You've been to Louisiana, some of you have. But at the same time, there's so many roads and so many parts of Louisiana that have no real roads and bridges. It's hard to get by. It's extraordinarily primitive. And those wealthy enclaves in Shreveport, in a lesser sense, but in Baton Rouge and certainly New Orleans to a greater extent, had for years ignored the vast majority of Louisiana, the rank and file of Louisiana, the poor and the working class of Louisiana. They've been ignored. The oil that had come out of the ground in Louisiana was mostly collected by these wealthy individuals, and Huey Long was a populist, perhaps the greatest of all the populists, and he played on it. And Long was able to talk to people in a way that they could understand, and Huey was able to not only talk to them, but he looked like a winner. He was not a hayseed racist in the sense that you would have these populist racists of the early 1900s in these southern states that would really play and throw the race card all over the place. You didn't see Long do that, basically. I'm not saying Huey Long was an enlightened man on that subject. He was not particularly reconstructed, but at the same time, he had no interest in race baiting compared to, say, Theodore Bilbo in Mississippi or some of the other characters you get in other southern states. What Long could do, though, is he could talk to Louisianans. He dressed like $1 million, but he could talk to them like he come from them, because he did. Huey Long grew up on a farm in Winfield, which is Winfield Parish, or Wynn Parish in Winfield, Louisiana, which is in northern, not north Louisiana, but north of Alexandria, or they call it over there Elec. But anyways, Huey Long grew up in that part of the world, which was a hotbed of William Jennings Bryan populism. And Huey Long, the last name's Long, is as English as it comes. And one of the things to remember about Louisiana is that Louisiana is a diverse state, and I don't mean the conventional stuff. It's fair to remember about Louisiana is that Louisiana is broken down into about 2 or 3 basic regions. You have, at least as far as demography is concerned, you've got the Baptist, Methodist, Anglo Bible Belt up north in the Pines, say Shreveport, Monroe, Winfield even, all that territory through there. Those last names are just like Huey Long's last name, Long. That is as English of a last name as it comes. That is an Anglo. Because if you thought that Louisiana was all a bunch of Boudreaux and Thibodeaux and so forth, meaning the Cajun aspect, that's a bunch of garbage. Down south, obviously, that becomes more the case. The French Acadiana, the Cajuns and the Creoles, many of whom are Catholic, many of whom are very different than the northern neighbors. And then you have New Orleans, which is kind of a region unto itself with the banks. and the port and all. But the thing about Long was he could talk to them all. He had that ability to speak to those people, and they would vote for him. Not just because he seemingly could con them. Heck, he gave them stuff. And that's the thing. That's when you get those guys, if you give them get people things, they might vote for you, especially if you give them roads and bridges. And in the case of Huey Long, he didn't just give them roads and bridges. He built buildings for them. In addition to that, he got natural gas piped into cities or towns that hadn't had it before. Not to say that they gave the gas away, but they got it in, which there wasn't a big profit margin, so most of those big corporations that handled the gas weren't interested in it. So Long got that done. It's also fair to remember that if you looked at Louisiana educationally prior to Huey Long, it was garbage. I mean, I'm not saying Louisiana became the Harvard of the South after Huey Long, but I am saying is that most people who were not wealthy or come from the elite class of Louisiana prior to Huey Long, if they went to school, they didn't get out of the 5th grade, basically. And that it was worse for blacks than it was for whites, but it was bad for them all. There was the illiteracy rate was illiteracy was through the roof. Education was through the floor. The books were tattered if you had any, and you didn't have any pencils and papers. You still sometimes just used old chalk slate boards. Huey Long basically said, we'll give you free pencils and paper, we'll give you free textbooks, we'll give you education. And then, for some of the kids who had real ability, who could have never gone to school, he put them through LSU and other universities. He paid for them to go, or at least subsidized these kids to go to LSU, which was kind of the baby of Huey Long. If you are an LSU football fan, or if you've ever heard them play, or you watched them at A&M, one of the things is one of the common songs and refrains of the Marching Tiger Band is "Touchdown for LSU," which was put forward by Huey Long, or at least one of his band directors. Dun 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 dun. That's the opening sound. But anyway, so if you watch an LSU game next year, if we have football, you might hear that opening dun 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 dun. Anyway, so that's that. You can look it up on YouTube, no problem. Well, anyways, all that to say is Huey Long will give a lot. Build bridges across the Mississippi River and even open charity hospitals for the sick. Again, I'm not saying this is a panacea and a utopia. I am saying is that compared to where it was, Louisiana got a lot. Now, remember this about a man like Huey Long. You're going to you don't get something for nothing in life. That's unless you win the lottery, and even then I would argue that you have to give up something to get that big wad of cash. But you're going to have to give something over. For those who did not work for the state of Louisiana, those who were not able to get a job with Louisiana, but they were benefiting from it because they had been remembered, as it were, by Huey Long and the Long machine, as they called it. The fact is that they gave their votes to Huey Long. Huey Long and his friends, they collected and received the votes of the poor. So there's a lot of votes right there. Number two, if you did work for the state of Louisiana and you got a job on a road crew or some other sort of bureaucratic affair, and Louisiana was employing a lot of people to build this new Louisiana at the behest of Huey Long, the fact is that you were expected not just to vote for Long, but you were also expected to support him politically. Literally, you were deducted 10% out of your salary to go to the Long political machine. They kept it literally in a box. It's been called historically the deduct box. But you literally had 10% of your salary deducted and donated against your will, so to speak. So it's not maybe a donation then, but it was given over to Huey Long, and you supported his campaign. He got you the job. He expected the return. That's the thing is that it wasn't just the goodness of his heart. Huey Long did it, I think, partially out of the goodness of his heart, but he was also in it for Huey Long. I mean, he wanted to aggrandize himself. He wanted to be somebody. He wanted to move beyond Louisiana, and this was his way of doing it. He becomes governor in 1928, and in 1930 he runs for and is elected to the U.S. Senate. By the way, his enemies impeached him, and then he turned the tables on them, and he then started to rout them. I mean, just will drive them into the ocean. Huey Long screws down the lid on Louisiana pretty tight. And in all honesty, if you get to reading about it, Huey Long was some form of a dictator in Louisiana in the late 20s and especially the first half of the 1930s. Long ran that state lock, stock, and barrel, whether he was a U.S. senator or a governor, because the man who replaces him in the governor's chair is his old boyhood acolyte, a guy named Oscar K. Allen, or O.K. Allen, who was not his own man. O.K. Allen was just kind of a non-entity of a character. And Long was a sort of man, and by the way, the joke was about Allen, Governor Allen, that he was so agreeable. Earl Long, Huey's brother, who Huey and Earl didn't always get along very well. Interesting stories there, too. But anyways, Earl made the snide remark one day about O.K. Allen, said that one day a leaf blew in and landed on the governor's desk, and the governor signed that leaf, too. The idea of the being is that he was so agreeable that he'd sign anything put before him. But Huey Long demanded loyalty, and if you were against him, you better gird for battle, because that man would fight, and he'd fight you hard, and he'd get you too, probably. Huey Long is going to promote pensions. He's going to promote old age pensions and so forth. In fact, actually, he has, in the depths of the Depression coming into the Roosevelt administration, he has a program called Share Our Wealth. A slogan called "Every Man a King," songs with that as well. I mean, it's a singing era in many respects, but every man a king, and you can be a millionaire. Share Our Wealth basically is the idea that you need to tax in a confiscatory way, tax the very wealthy. An idea being that no one should make over, I think it was like $250,000 a year in their money. And if you had a estate over $5 million or whatever the number was that Long put out, and he moved it around from time to time, you basically would have that confiscated as well. So basically, say Jeff Bezos, who is the master of Amazon, or other prominent wealthy men that you may think of, the idea with Huey Long would be is to take their money and to give it to the poor. Kind of a Robin Hood scheme, share our wealth, that sort of thing there. So a national pension for the aged, and on I can go. But Huey Long's ideas were there, and he had a lot of friends, he had a lot of enemies, and remember the year I keep saying is 1935, is that's when his story ends. The reason I bring him up is because when you talk about politics, or you talk about history and politics and national movements, you're always going to have to keep that issue of politics in the back of your mind, because in the American setting, you're going to have an election coming up. Franklin Roosevelt in 1935 is looking to run for president for a second term, and he is a favorite in 1935. However, the issue you've got in 1935 is that the economy has not recovered to the old 20s sort of roar, or even the pale copy of that. In many respects, it hadn't recovered all that much at all. The New Deal was maybe floundering, and Huey Long is the radical on the left of Franklin Roosevelt's flank, promoting share our wealth, every man a king. We need to basically spread the largesse of the wealthy, take in its essence, the Robin Hood, take from the wealthy and give to the poor, and everyone have a basic means for living, such as a certain income and so on. And he is promoting it, and he is on the radio. He in his own way is a very dynamic speaker. To us, it may not fit very well, but if you ever watch him, he appeals to people who are hurting, and he looks like he's fighting for you, because in some respects he has. I'm not trying to tell you that Long is a good man. I have my doubts about him. He's a very dangerous man, frankly. But there is an attractiveness to him to those who are hurting, starving, and feel like they'd been forgotten. And so Roosevelt is wanting to make sure that Long does not steal any of his thunder. Certainly Long does not steal any votes from Roosevelt. And so Huey Long's centerpiece was, let's have a national old age pension, effectively, the share our wealth idea, especially for the aged. Now, Roosevelt's not going to go that far, but remember the year. In 1935, one of the, probably maybe the crown jewel, that may be an arguable statement on my part, but one of the crown jewels of the New Deal certainly is the Social Security Act. The Social Security Act is a form of, I would argue, it's a form of a pyramid scheme in the sense that as long as you have a lot of people paying into the pool of money for the Social Security pension, as long as you've got a lot of workers paying into that, you have a few at the top taking out, it works just fine. It's not, when I say pyramid scheme, it sounds like I'm trying to say it's some sort of con. It's not. It's just it's just the basic idea. If you fund, a lot of people are funding it, it produces more, there's more money there than can be taken out. Because in the early days of the Social Security Act, and so on, the Social Security Administration, the fact is that you had just a few taking out at the top, most paying in at the bottom, and so on. But the idea, the Social Security was not supposed to be an old age pension, strictly speaking. It was not supposed to be retirement, strictly speaking. But at the same time, it was supposed to help the aged and the unemployed out with effectively the basics, the very basics of life, be able to buy groceries and such. And so when you talk about Roosevelt's SSA, the Social Security Administration, and that act, it is in a sense a watered down and a smaller version of Huey Long's Share Our Wealth. I think that Roosevelt was trying to help the people, to be fair, but I think probably more so, in my opinion, me being a little bit perhaps jaded and cynical, and have known politicians either personally and from a professional sense, from a distance, there was also the calculation that if we pass the Social Security Act, you are going to be able to wall off Huey Long and take some of the air out of his balloon. I think that worked, but it also helped, too, that Huey Long got gunned down in the Capitol building, his Capitol building. He built it, frankly, there in Baton Rouge. It's worth your time to stop if you're over at Baton Rouge for an A&M baseball or football game or whatever happens. You're over there for some reason, stop at the Capitol building. It's a fascinating trip. But Long got killed by one of his political enemies. They gunned him down the Capitol. It's in September 35. Anyways, Long is dead, but the idea is there. And even to the present time, to some degree, but certainly in the second half of the 20th century, nobody ever talked about reforming or doing away with Social Security. But once you got it, if you ever talked about changing Social Security to any real measure, and by the way, in the early days, you could take out after it was capitalized properly, you could take out as a benefit. You could basically take Social Security out at age, what was it, 62. Well, the thing is, the average life expectancy of an American was 62 years old at that point in time, so that's part of the reason why it was so very solvent. Over time, the amount of people who could take it and keep pulling out of it, and the age never raised up as much, and so the amount of people paying, or rather taking out, got bigger, and the base got more narrow, and so it's, instead of being a pyramid like it was in the early days, it's more of almost an upright square. We'll see what happens with Social Security over time. You and I might get some money out of it. I don't hold my breath on that. I don't ever worry about that. I try to have my own retirement. But all that to say is that the Social Security Administration is also a great political weapon for Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats. Anytime the Republicans would ever talk about we need to change Social Security, basically, especially in the 20th century, with people who had lived through the Great Depression or had seen mom and dad live through it, but that Social Security check helped them keep moving, you were touching the third rail. So even into the early 21st century, you'd hear, say, Bush administration talk about fixing Social Security and making it more pyramidal. Again, it was a political non-starter, and it hurts. So that's kind of the third rail in American politics. It's and it in a sense produced a whole lot of voters for the Democrats over the years because it was Roosevelt who did it. The last part of the New Deal that I'm going to talk on is one of the bricks and mortar ideas, and it's probably the biggest of the groups. There's a lot of ones out there. There's the PWA, which is the Public Works Administration. But the one I want to use is the Works Progress Administration, WPA. Some people have waggishly said it stood for We Piddle Around. But the Works Progress Administration was established in the mid-1930s and basically terminates with the beginnings of World War II. It is a Workfare program at its core, but for those of you who are not familiar with a WPA or a WPA project, you probably actually are. You might not have recognized it as well. Some very famous WPA projects, or even PWA, which is kind of a sister organization, would be if you're from the Dallas area. If you've ever been to the State Fair at Dallas, that's an example of a PWA or WPA project. The State Fairgrounds, not the Cotton Bowl Stadium itself, but the buildings and such and the grounds, that's all WPA. For those of you down in the San Antonio region or been to the San Antonio area, the WPA, PWA helped build the original Riverwalk. So if you've ever been on vacation down in that part of the world, the Riverwalk is really a government project at its core, and it's always been to some degree. It's just a matter of what. But that's there too. For me personally, I can think of several around my house. An example would be at Snook, they had a little low wall made of red bricks, and it was just basically a make-work project. We need to build a wall here. Okay, what does it need to look like? Well, it's an ornamental wall. Well, you build it. Over at a town right down the road from me where my mail actually comes from, so if you ever saw my address, it'd say Somerville, Texas. I've mentioned it in class before. Somerville is a railroad town, but two of the school's major buildings, even to this day, that are still used and are beloved in a way by the people. They call it the Rock, but I've always sneeringly called it the Alamo because Somerville football has never been very good. It's a last stand sort of thing. But anyways, their football stadium was built by the federal government, the WPA, PWA, and the same thing for their old basketball arena known as the Yawa Center was a PWA project. Even in Caldwell, which is the county seat of Burleson County, same sort of idea. A gym that was used for years by the high school was a PWA, WPA project. All that to say is those are tangible things that many people who did not have jobs were able to make to survive by building. And what it produces is, yes, workfare, and it produces, and in some cases, very attractive buildings. Other times they're just dog ugly. But all that to say is that even into the 21st century, in these small to middle-sized towns, and some of you actually might know these sorts of stories yourself, that if you were to come up and say, you know what, that Alamo, that old football stadium at Somerville has played its part, or maybe the gym at Caldwell, and this is really the one I'm thinking of, the gym at Caldwell has played its part. It's just inadequate for the time. It's inadequate for 2010 or whatever year you want, and we just need to knock it down and move on. You will have not just the old who may have built it, they're already gone though, meaning dead, but you will have their descendants coming out of the woodwork basically saying, how dare you tear down something my great-grandfather built? I don't always understand the attachment of those old buildings like that, but at the same time, there is an attachment to them. The WPA or the public PWA is going to employ millions of individuals building those sorts of buildings or other things like it. Secondly, and the WPA is also going to employ thousands of out-of-work artists. If you've ever been into some of the Art Deco, it's an architectural style for the time period. If you've ever been to some of the Art Deco post offices in the United States and you saw murals painted on the wall, those are old WPA projects. But the fact of the matter is they employed those artists to do that. You'll also see oral histories. Historians are going to be hired by the WPA to go out and record histories of, the old Negro spirituals, old songs in the field. I think you used to do, was it Woody Guthrie who did it? Well, anyways, all that to say is that there's a whole lot more than just bricks and mortar, but most famously bricks and mortar is part of the story of the WPA and the PWA. But hiring of this, that, and the other, it's very much a workfare project. But ultimately, when you look at the overall history of the New Deal, it does not alleviate the Great Depression. It does alleviate the worst effects of the Great Depression, but it does not bring the country out of depression. You could say, arguably, that it helps at the lowest point during before World War II really starts to affect the economics of the United States. The lowest you could see the unemployment rate in the United States around 10-12%. And then even in 1937, it's called the Roosevelt Recession. In 1937, you're going to see a dip in productivity and a rise in, there's a rise in unemployment. It gets up to about 18% again. Roosevelt at times will become frustrated with the Supreme Court, whom he thought was being primitive and too hidebound to the Constitution, and there was a threat to pack the United States Supreme Court. Anyways, the Supreme Court eventually starts to go along with the New Deal. But all this to say is that Roosevelt gets 2 terms out of his efforts to alleviate the Great Depression. And Franklin Roosevelt, as I said before to you, is a great president. I don't think it's here. I do not think it's in the New Deal that it's his masterpiece. I mean, you can spend a lot of money and it may not matter all that much. I think Roosevelt's greatest effect as a president is actually his handling of World War II. And he's going to run, Roosevelt will, in 1940 for a 3rd term. Other presidents had nosed around and sniffed around for the 3rd term. Grant famously did, but didn't get it. But Roosevelt in 1940 is going to run for and get that 3rd term. He doesn't get it nearly the big landslide that he had in 1932 or 36 even, because there were a lot of Americans turned off by the idea of violating the sacred Washington 2-term rule. But Roosevelt, he liked being president, and there was a lot of Americans who liked him being president too. In fact, actually, you would see in the 1930s and 40s that for those who had really been hurt by the Great Depression, you would see people who put Roosevelt's picture up in their house right next to maybe a religious icon or a cross or a picture of Jesus or something else, somebody else. The fact of the matter is that Roosevelt is elected in 1940 for an unprecedented 3rd term. And that sets the stage for World War II. He'll be the president during that time period. But speaking of World War II, here we go. We're ready to now turn to the final leg of this course, and we're going to talk about World War II in fairly good detail, and those will be the subjects of the next 2 or 3 lectures.